love and also hate ads from our childhood. Now, we always have that one particular ad that we'll always treasure in our hearts. But I'm particularly fascinated by vintage ads because they give us a snapshot into the life and times of a bygone era. So, in today's episode, we're going to take a look back, or probably take several steps back, and look at advertising in the pre independence era. We'll take a deep dive and look at the ideas and the imagery that inspired the ads and the businesses of that time. My guest today is Ramya Ramamurthy. Now, she is a lady who wears many hats. She's an author, she's a documentary filmmaker, a broadcast journalist, and also a communication specialist. She has extensively covered the Indian ad industry during her career with media houses such as CNBC, Star World, and National Geographic. Today, we'll discuss some themes from her latest book. It's called Branded in History: Fresh Marketing Lessons from Vintage Ads. I'm really excited about this book because it really examines the interplay between ads, business, and the rather the nationalist movement from the pre-independence era right up to the 1940s and the 50s. So, in fact, I'm so excited about this book. I just hope there's going to be a part two to the series. So, welcome to the show, Ramya. Great to talk to you.
Thanks, Roshali. Thanks for having me.
uh, right before we get into this whole business of the ads and the industry back then, uh, I'd love you to sort of set the stage for what it really was like, what the challenge was like for marketers back then, because it was a very different world that we were living in.
Yeah, actually, it's very hard to fathom. On the one hand, you think like that's another era. It's like it's hard to think of a world pre 1947 or even a world pre 19th in the 19th century, for example, where you think they didn't have like basic amenities, right? Like um, we were not free, firstly, so we couldn't make our own laws and start our own businesses and launch products, which was a big sort of barrier to uh, entering the brand market. There was also the fact that we didn't have much disposable income. We were still a colony, and a lot of our sort of surplus revenue was going back to the empire, and it was not ours to spend, and we were seen as a nation of poor people. There might have been the 1% of that time who were as sort of rich as the people who were ruling us, but there was still not enough money to go around to sort of spend on brands and spend on advertising, really. And
Right.
what would you spend it on? We didn't have television stations. We didn't have, I mean, radio came much later. So it was
Yeah.
pretty much just print and outdoor. And if you were innovative about it, you could do a lot of sort of below the line activity, which would sort of really drum up interest in your brand. But the best thing that I really want to highlight about this era was that there was no concept of a brand. When
Right.
we talk about soaps, it's a very recent phenomena. We were till like the late 19th century, early 20th century, we were using like homemade uptan and DIY stuff to cleanse ourselves. Like soaps were not considered a must have in your wardrobe, in your sort of regime every morning. You don't wake
Right.
up and sort of decide what brand you wanted, because literally you were
Yeah.
just making it yourself and just using what you had. So to ask people who were doing it themselves to then say, hey, why don't you spend 6 annas this week on these 3 bars of toilet soap, or what, that's what they were called then.
Yeah.
And then they'd be like, oh, why do I need this? So persuading people to part with really hard earned money at a time when branding as a concept didn't exist, I think that was the real challenge.
Yeah, and like you said, you have to build this audience, which was first used to sort of doing it at home, making their products at home, and creating that whole brand at that point. And soaps were a great point to start with, right? Because they also were the first businesses that really grew in India. I think in your book, you've sort of shed light into uh, the soap industry that started, and its sort of connections to something more basic and more solid, the steel industry, right?
Yeah, so actually, the idea of soaps as an industry, pretty much all industry in India, is because we are fast moving towards becoming a colony that will soon become independent. And the leaders of that time, the leaders who were trying to work towards independence, realized very sort of smartly that we needed products of our own, we needed industry of our own, and we needed all kinds of products and industry of our own to make sure that we could make this transition and not sort of stumble as a new democracy. So pretty much every industry, from steel to cement to textiles to everything, was sort of being launched by Indian entrepreneurs using Indian money. And the surprising thing is that alongside all these heavy industries, which you need, right? You need roads, you need factories, you need steel, you need everything that to build things in that country at that point. People decided we also needed homegrown soaps and homegrown beauty
Yeah.
products and homegrown sort of snacks, which may not have seemed as like such a priority at that time. But it's so fascinating that Godrej, for example, Ardeshir Godrej made his fortunes and his name as a company and a brand that made safes. They made locks and safes,
Right.
and to pivot from that suddenly to making soaps, and their USP was the fact that they were making soaps that did not use any animal products. There was no animal fat. Because at that point, there were soaps in India. They were being used primarily by the 1%, the people who could afford it. And they were made by Western brands, European and American brands that had animal fat in them. The USP of Godrej was that they did not use any animal products, and they were made completely with vegetable oil as a replacement, because he realized very smartly that Indians would not spend on anything that had animal products in them because of
Right.
this notion of purity.
Right.
So to pivot from making safes to making soaps, and he called his soaps also very sort of very strange names. Like his first name soap was Chavi, Watani, because he was trying to make you remember that this is for the Watan. So they were marketing and making soaps because they felt like Indian products should be in every array of every sort of touch point that we had as a consumer in India. And it literally was like all hands on deck. You figured out what you needed to make soap. You figured out a way to market it so that people realized, hey, we need to buy soap and we need to buy Indian
Yeah.
soap. And then you found a
Yeah.
way, like a niche where vegetable oil based soap was suddenly like more popular than other products in the market. So that I
Yeah.
thought was
And that's
fascinating.
Yeah, and it also connects. He's building the brand at that point because he says Chabi, which is again it's connected to his steel business back then. So people, the consumer can make that connection. Hey, this is the company that got us these very reliable safes, and now they're doing this, so we would want to trust them. So, great
Yeah.
idea there as well.
And
The
he
other
also had the
interesting thing,
very smart idea of labeling his products in reverse order. So he launched the number three product first and then went back to number one because he felt people would try the number three and think, hey, this is good. So then when he launches number two and number one, they'll be like, this has to be better because we tried number three and it was pretty good. So very smart,
that's
very smart.
awesome. I love that idea. That's true. And the other thing about soaps, which is very interesting at that time, either that time or probably a little later on in the 40s and in 30s and 40s, you have this association of the soap with beauty, with the beauty queens, with the film industry at that time, which was also growing, right? This I think you had the first film ambassadors for soaps. I think back then you had, I think, you had Leela Chitnis at that point, and also Devika Rani were
Yeah.
promoting soaps. This also sort of coincided with the rise of the studio system, the rise of female stars, right? Superstars who were probably earning much more than their male counterparts in the industry at that time.
Yeah, it was a topsy-turvy world in a lot of sense because women had more sort of license. If you see the movies of that era, uh, there's kisses on screen. Women are really sort of uh, they're bosses of their own sort of realm. They're seen as action heroes. They're seen as stars that launch and sustain studios of that era. And they were co-owners of several studios as well. Like Himanshu Rai and Devika Rani famously, and they were seen as real sort of power agents, not just beautiful faces. And Lux had this smart idea of snapping up sort of Leela Chitnis for their ads in 1930s. But not many people know that Palmolive had the same idea. They had also signed on Devika Chitnis and Sulochana for a campaign that was very similar. And suspiciously, just before the Lux campaign launched, Palmolive sort of shelved theirs. So maybe we would have had a different version of sort of
Yeah.
the film star's choice if Palmolive had decided to go ahead at that point. But Lux famously has sort of been the film star's choice from that era. And it's pretty telling that they never gave up that marketing tack. It's been the
Right.
same since for 100 years now, for over 100 years now. So it seems like that was a sort of, it was a sense of appealing to women who were obviously the primary consumers of a product like this, but it was also sort of having a sort of overall marketing strategy of saying our product is not just about what it does, but it's about what it represents. And now we have film stars sort of being brand ambassadors for everything under the sun, pretty much, like from uh, luxury products and luxury sort of watches and jewelry and whatnot. You also have them sort of advertising in India, for instance, pan masala. And funnily enough, at that time, the real influencers were also political leaders. So Mahatma Gandhi was actually a key figure in launching so many products, right from sort of Godrej. He convinced Adesha Godrej to actually launch the product. He had, sort of people launching pharmaceutical products, launching steel industries, launching literally every product category where he sort of goaded them to say, come and launch a product. Famously, there was a sort of person who was with him in South Africa who came back to India because he had also faced racism. And he launched a tea brand called Wagh Bakri Chai because he wanted a tea that promoted equality and not sort of the racism that he had encountered. So name the category, and there was the influencer there was actually Gandhi. And then you also had people like Rabindranath Tagore and Annie Besant who had sort of lent their name and written testimonials for Godrej soaps, saying that we use these soaps and we find them incredible. And that was done obviously, like, not even as a marketing thing. It was seen as a nation building and a sort of made in India narrative that was sort of lent credibility by their testimonial. And to think of them as brand ambassadors seems really odd because they're not what you traditionally think of as brand ambassadors today. But in the sense of the influence that they had in a nation that was sort of looking to be free from the colonial sort of yoke, it was amazing brand integration. And what they were promoting, after all, was the fact that use products that are made in India, made for you as Indians and by Indians. So I think that was brilliant.
Absolutely. I mean, just think of it. Would you associate Rabindranath Tagore with a soap brand or even Annie Besant? Uh, but they, like you said, they were the influencers. People looked up to them, and they were the people with the biggest brands themselves at that time, right? They were the most famous
Yeah,
at that time, so it made
yeah.
sense to align with particular brands and industries at that point. So, yeah, so they had a pretty big influence even in setting up industries at that time, right? That's what your book also explores. Um, the interplay of,
Um,
let's say, political leaders with business. I wouldn't say political leaders, but really leaders of the independence movement with the industry at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was it it there were a lot of factors at play here, right? It was not easy to start industries at that point. The Company Act that was passed in that era favored the existing colonial regime. It was not easy to find money to start a company, even if you found the way to go through all the bureaucracy and start a company. Banks were set up at that time to address this problem. They said we needed Indian capital because no one else would finance our company, so let's band together and create banks. Um, we were already in the business of textiles, but most of that for was for export. So the whole business of khadi for Indian independence had to be sort of launched with the help of Indian businessmen, and pretty much every sector. So Tata Steel, for instance, there was a effort made to build steel because they were marketing themselves as the nation builders. And it was very clear they were building a nation that would become free. And Gandhi actually visited Jamshedpur in 1925. And J.R.D. Tata actually writes to his father at that time. He was in France at that point. He writes to him in a letter saying, I wish we had captured this, Pathé is doing this in France now. I wish we had captured this visit on film because imagine what a great marketing opportunity it would have been. And it's so prescient and canny of him to know that a person like Gandhi visiting your plant gives it legitimacy, gives it credibility, and justifies why you had to spend all that money to build a plant there made with Indian money and Indian entrepreneurship. Because people had to see what it was in service of, and it was really ultimately in the service of the nation and the citizens of that nation. And it's incredibly sort of ahead of its time to realize that and to sort of articulate that so well.
Right.
And I think he like I said, he had a influence in pretty much every industry that came up at that time. You see a connection with it, and he also understood his own brand. Like his brand, which was this person who
Right.
wore clothes of a certain type, which
Right.
was not Western, who
Right.
abhorred sort of all Western sort of comfort. He famously slept and ate and bathed and lived in a very sort of Puritan, almost ascetic manner. And he had this brand to maintain, which was he was a
Right.
father of the nation who lived a very specific way. And for instance, he sort of knew his appeal when
Right.
um, Cipla was being set up. The owner of Cipla actually wanted him to come and visit his factory, and Gandhi was like very clear that he doesn't do these visits, and he had to sort of entreat him and say, "No, this is not like a regular factory. It's a scientific laboratory. We're trying to build actual, sort of medicines that will heal Indians." And then he thought about it for a while and asked Dr. Hamid, the owner of Cipla, to take him for a drive to the dentist in Juhu. So they sort of went around Bombay in a car driven by Dr. Hamid, and
Wow.
he dropped him back in town. And the next day, this drive was sort of splashed across all the papers, and everybody who knew who Dr. Hamid was, because that
Yeah.
is brand recall. But imagine being seen with someone like the Michael Jordan story, for
Yeah.
instance. Just being seen
Absolutely.
with
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
like that would just make your brand cool. Like it, he made
Exactly.
Nike
And
cool.
think think of the
Yeah,
photo op,
so
right? The
it's like
first thing you're thinking of in the media. Think of the
exactly,
photo op
and
and
he knew that,
think of the ripples.
and
Yeah.
he was not. Yeah, so he knew the power of his own image and how it would be covered and how it would be conveyed. And literally, like after that visit and after he actually visited the factory, that brand never looked back. They were suffering in terms of profitability at that point, and from then on, they never had any trouble. So he understood not just what was needed for India to sort of survive as a nation in a young democracy, but also the fact that this is how imaging and brand sort of
Works.
representation
Yeah.
works.
Yeah. I'd like to pivot at this point. Yeah, we learned about the Swadeshi movement, how it had the effect on industries, brands. Also wanted to talk a little bit about the other narrative which was going on at that time, uh, which is around centered around, very funnily enough, it's centered around energy. The idea of people having low energy and going on. We had a lot of products coming out. There are a couple of reasons I think behind it as well. Like you also had the factories coming up at that point, so there was this notion that we need laborers to work more hours, therefore they need more energy. But you have some very interesting examples in your book, right? Could you just take us through some of them?
So it's really fascinating how we see ourselves, right? That's really what advertisers and marketers of that era were tapping into. And the prevalent notion at that time was that the upper caste Indian, and caste is very sort of apparent in every time they describe the Indian. So they were very aware of it. And sometimes it feels a little jarring to hear people refer to as Brahmin and Banya and whatnot. But it's very clear that it was a construct that
Right.
was favoring certain castes over others. And you see that they always mention Indians as these very sort of weak, rickety, thin,
Yeah.
scrawny,
Yeah.
impoverished people.
Yeah.
Gandhi himself writes about it in some of his works. And it's seen as a real sort of deterrent to our becoming any sort of power in the post
Yeah.
uh, sort of British regime, right? And a lot of people tap into it. So you have the ones who are like, hey, you should have glucose energy. So have Parle Glucon D, which becomes Parle G famously. And all it
Right.
is really sugar, right? It's giving you that
Sugar.
instant
Right.
energy, and that became famous. But you also have all these like tonics, which are basically, there's no scientific basis to a lot of these claims.
Yeah.
But they're telling you, hey, they're using euphemisms for the fact that men can't perform, and then this will vitalize your life,
Yeah.
which is all like
So
a sort of
bad.
nudge, nudge, wink, wink about what it can really do. And they were at that
Yeah.
time known as sex tonics of that era, and a lot of companies
Without
made their
calling it
money with
that.
this.
Yeah. Without
Yeah.
calling it that,
And
obviously.
they sort of find ways to mention things. They'll say in Gujarati, they would say, sort of the weakness of the night, which was one of the terms like Ratu
Yeah. Yeah.
Kamjori or something.
Yeah. Night starvation, right? That's the one in
Night
the Horlicks
starvation
ad
energy. Yeah.
that's in your book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that they say you need to have holics to address this starvation that happens. Get up and have holics, and you'll get that job, you'll get that wife, you'll
Yeah.
have a perfect life. And they didn't just target like the poorer or the working class people. It was also white collar people, because they show a
Right.
clerk who can't do his job and he's worried he may not get a
Right.
promotion, and he has holics, and then everything is
Yeah.
set for him.
It's really set up as almost like a comic book ad, right? Because again, it talks about, like what you mentioned, the lack of resources at that point. They had to make use of every medium possible to just get their message out.
Yeah, and they used like whatever they could, right? They used pamphlets. They had tram tickets with this stuff. They had hoardings on tram stops and all over the city. A lot of it was in regional language, because that's what people read more than English language at that time. It was also represented like, like you said, like a graphic sort of novel almost, so that people could easily understand. And, sort of literacy was not a barrier to sort of marketing these products. And that was all like a sign that these brands were understanding what their consumer needed and giving it to them. And it worked, because all these products did gangbusters at that time.
Right, and the other interesting thing was that how they created an event sometimes in, when they didn't really have the print ads and so on. I think one of the soaps that they did, they actually had a big event just to launch their product out into the market, right?
Yeah, so a lot of them did these fabulous things, which now you'd probably, it would just be hard to pull off something like that, and you would just not think in such scale, like basically Mysore sandal soap was marketed as the royal soap, because it smelt royal as sandalwood did. It was launched by the royal house of Mysore. The Wadeyar sort of commissioned a scientist to go study abroad, study at IISc, which was just launched then in Bangalore. They came up with a formulation to make this product, and a lot of it was really scientifically well backed, but they had to appeal to the consumer in a way that would be really eye catching for them. So everything from the product packaging, which was made to resemble like a jewelry box, the way the product was round rather than a bar of soap, the way at that point in unified India they held a camel procession in Karachi to sort of market the product. And everyone did this. For instance, Dalda, when they were launching in India, fried puris at every shop front to sell their product and to prove that it was the best at
Wow.
frying things. So imagine
Wow.
the effort at setting up
Yeah.
these counters in every shop front and making fresh puris for everyone to try. And what better testimonial for your product than something like that, right? So they actually really went super grassroots or super sort of fantastical in marketing
Right.
their products. And it was really an example of sort of not allowing resource scarcity to constrain your creativity, sort of just think of the best idea and
Yeah.
get
Let
go
loose.
do it
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. And they somehow got the budgets for it. So that was great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots more to chat on. Well, we are going to be discussing how women have been portrayed in ads through the ages, and we'll also dissect some of our favorite ads from our childhoods. The conversation continues in the next episode, so please do tune in. The link is given in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you again soon.